And welcome back. We're back on the TRX today, or I should say the TRX4 today. Did a little bit of work on this throughout the week as time permitted, and after testing a couple things and using some bidirectional tests in the scan tool, which we'll get into here a little bit later. If you remember from the previous video, what we have is an extended crank time. The vehicle will eventually start, but extremely rough idle, misfires on cylinders 3 through 8, but it will stay running if you feather the gas pedal and give it a little bit of fuel. So taking that information along with using some bidirectional tests in the scan tool itself, the first thing we did was, since we knew that cylinders 1 and 2 were firing okay regardless, over here on the passenger side, we took the coil for cylinder 2, swapped it for cylinder 4, and the misfire didn't move. In other words, cylinder 2 stayed okay, cylinder 4 continued to misfire. So then we used our test light, and I'll show you this here once we get today's work done, and tested for voltage and control on a couple of the coils that it says were constantly misfiring. So in this case we're picking on cylinder 4 since it was easy to get to, and we could see 12 volt. We could also see the switched negative line, because these are the coils and the fuel injectors both on this engine are negative switch and controlled directly by the PCM. So using the test light, we could see the test light flash on that control line, so that told us the PCM has control over the coil. We also did the same thing to the injector for number 4 as well. We verified that it does have constant power, and we verified that the PCM has control over it, so we could see that flash, that pulse. So it is commanding it to fire. After this, we then went into the scan tool, and again I'll show you this a little bit later directly on the scan tool itself, and started going through some of the bidirectional tests. One of the tests we can do is that we can manually toggle the fuel injectors and make sure that they're firing. Now earlier when I said we verified power at the coils and power at the injectors, that also proved out our Asd relay. And if you're unfamiliar with that, Dodge uses what they call an auto shutdown device, which is basically just a relay. That relay powers up when you have the key on and you're starting to crank the engine. So don't let that fool you. If you're checking for your constant power feed to your coils and to your injectors, the key has to be on and you have to be actively cranking it. But using the scan tool, we can fire the injectors individually and one at a time. I should say one at a time. But we started with injector 1, allowed it to cycle. We could hear the Asd relay kick in, and we could hear the click, the telltale click of the injector firing. And we had that symptom for all 8 injectors except for 1. Cylinder number 5 injector does not click. It is not firing. So it's either stuck open or it's stuck closed. I'm theorizing that it's stuck open because of the other symptoms we're getting that we saw on the scan tool while we were giving it gas and forcing it to stay running. And that the oxygen sensors, when we graph those out, and again I'll show you those here later, as the engine's running, you could see they start to show a very, very rich condition. And you can smell kind of raw gas coming out of the exhaust. Now, one of the other telltale signs is white smoke. I did not check for that at the time, but again, we're showing a very rich running condition. We can smell fuel coming out of the exhaust. And since we can't actuate injector number 5, again, just leading to a theory that that injector is actually stuck open and just constantly dumping fuel into that cylinder. Also, on the first video when we were checking oil, even though the oil looked good, and we are in a little bit of a incline here, so our nose of the truck is kind of facing a little bit downhill, The oil level looked a little bit full, but I contributed that to us being on a decline. But also, the fuel did smell a little bit like gas. I mean, it's not uncommon after when an oil needs to be oil changed for it to smell a little bit like fuel, because it is responsible for picking up debris and particulates in the engine and kind of trapping it and holding on to it. But if that injector is stuck open, constantly washing fuel down the number 5 cylinder, it's eventually all going to end up in the crankcase and really make it smell like gas. So again, just something else that's pointing to the fact that we definitely could have a potentially stuck open injector. So with that being said, what we're going to do is get the fuel rail off the top of this motor and replace that number 5 injector. You'll have to forgive the noise. We got the battery charger running on this right now just to get this battery back up to snuff, because we have been cranking it quite a bit to do a bunch of testing. So we're going to, like I say, we're going to get this fuel rail off. We're going to pop it up. We're going to change out that number 5 injector. And then we'll come back and we'll do another crank test on this and see how things go. If we still have the same issues of the extended crank time, the rough idle, not wanting idle on its own, happen to give it gas to force it to stay running, then we'll take it the next step and do a compression test on each cylinder and just verify that we're getting decent compression, because you know, engines are, even though they have a bunch of sensors on them, there's a lot of stuff that can contribute to them not running. The basics are you need air, you need fuel, and you need spark. So we verified we're getting spark, and we also kind of did just to let you know, I forgot to mention this earlier, not only did we verify voltage and control with the coil, we went ahead and took one of the coils out, put a test spark plug in it, grounded it to engine ground, and cranked the engine over, and we could see the spark plug fire. Again, just confirming that we definitely do have control, we have power, and we definitely have spark coming out of what it says was a constantly misfiring cylinder. So there's a lot of things that can cause a multiple cylinder misfire. Right now, a stuck open injector, which we believe we have, either it's stuck open and stuck closed, but a stuck open injector does fit all the current symptoms we're having. So we know it's a failed part at this point. We're going to go ahead and change it out, and that will help us eliminate at least a known bad item, and then we can come back and start troubleshooting it again. But I'm going to get this fuel rail off of here. Once we get this injector changed out, we'll bring it back. Thank you much. And welcome back. So as you can see, we've got our fuel rail out, and we've got our number 5 injector removed at this point in time. And just to show you, if you remember, driver's side is 1357, passenger side is 246 and 8. So here's the injector itself. I'm going to clean the tips of these original injectors before we put it in. We're also going to make sure that the injector holes inside the intake are nice and clean before we go to reseat these, because you can see a fair amount of gunk on the end of this injector. The holes themselves, I mean, you can actually see them, and we wouldn't be able to see any dirt that's in it. We'd actually have to hook this up to a test rig and test fire it. But the little blue seal, it did have a blue seal. It flew off somewhere when it pulled out of that rail, because let me tell you, I think these are the original to the truck. I don't think they've ever been removed, because let me tell you, that fuel rail was in that intake pretty tight, and so was this injector into that rail. But again, this is the replacement one. It's a slightly, same part number, slightly different revision. I think this is an AD. And it looks like the original came with an AA. So same injector, just newer revision of the same injector. So we're going to work on getting these existing injectors, the ones that were clicking okay and presumably were firing okay. We're going to get those cleaned up. We'll get the new injector in here and get this reassembled. But this fuel rail is really no different than the fuel rail that's in the 6.4 there up on the hill, in the sense that There's four bolts, or I should say 3 bolts that are 10 millimeter. There's two on the passenger side rail here. The one closest to the firewall is an actual bolt, 10 millimeter bolt. Driver's side, you've got 2 bolts that hold it in place, both 10 millimeter. But you have one oddball. With this being a 1500, you'll see it's just a stand there, and that is on the fuel rail closest to the front of the truck. And the reason why that's there, that just has that ball and socket type mounting point for the engine cover. That's why it just looks a little different. And I believe this was a 13 millimeter, if I remember correctly. Just to get that off, because you'll see it kind of looks like we've got a little hexagon shape there at the top you can grab with a deep well socket. Okay, so with that being said, let's get some work to do. Let's get this back in. As far as removing the fuel line from the fuel rail, you will need a fuel line disconnect tool. Like I said, the 2500s with the 6.4s are a little bit more graceful with this. Maybe the newer 1500s are as well, I don't know. But on the 6.4, if you remember, once again, that up there, it actually had a push button that you could push in to get the fuel line off the fuel rail. This one, you need a tool to do that. Hence the Astro master line disconnect set. What I ended up using to get that fuel rail off was the bigger end here. I think this says this will handle either a 5/16 or a 3/8 inch tube. I used the bigger end, got it in, clipped it onto the line right in front of the connector that you see there. Pushed it ever so slightly into the connector, heard it click, and then the fuel line literally just kind of came right off. Now my understanding is sometimes that can be a little bit of a bear, and when you have your disconnect tool in there, you just kind of have to wiggle it, wiggle the line at the same time, but eventually you can get that line to break free. Like I said, a little bit of a better convenience on the newer models, but it's doable nonetheless. So we're going to work on getting this cleaned up, and then we'll get it back in there, and we'll bring it back. Thank you much. And welcome back. So I just want to show you this real quick. This is some of the fuel we drained out of the fuel rail and poured off the excess gas. And you can kind of see there, you can see that cloudy, murky kind of substance floating down there at the bottom that looks to be water. So it looks like there's a pretty good amount of water inside this fuel and various other contaminants. So what I'm going to do at this point is pull the other half of that fuel rail off, go ahead and drain the fuel out of it, and then we're going to work on getting the tank siphoned out, and then get about a good 5 to 10 gallons of fresh fuel in here before we attempt to start this back up again, just so we don't damage any injectors, because that will definitely cause us some run issues. With that being said, I'm going to get the other half of this fuel rail off, and we'll bring you back. Thank you much. And welcome back. I figured I'd give you a little bit better shot of that, and you can see it right there. We pulled the entire fuel rail off the motor, as you can see there, drained the other side of the fuel rail, and you can see that little bit of separation down there at the bottom. See, water is heavier than gasoline, so water will tend to sink to the bottom, as you can clearly see that separation there. So with the first bit of water plus that bit of water, I mean, yeah, there's going to be some water in your fuel tank, just from, you know, it's just outside elements and such, and depending on how good your gas station is. But typically gas stations have water filters and water separators in there. But as you can see there, there's a fair amount of water inside that fuel. Now again, we're going to hook up a line to the fitting in here and run it for a little bit and drain some fuel, you know, out of the tank, and just kind of see how bad it looks. Now that could have just been an accumulation that stayed inside the rail, because you can see there, that's a fair bit of fuel inside that rail, is all in that container. And that's about how much water you can tilt it this way, you'll kind of see it disappear, but if I come this way, you'll see it separate. So we're going to continue working on getting these bottoms of these injectors cleaned, get this new injector in here. Like I said, we're going to run the fuel pump for a little bit, pull another sample, and see if it's just pulling a bunch of water possibly out of the tank. If it is, then we'll siphon the tank and get some fresh gas and go from there. But we'll bring you back. Thank you much. And welcome back. So we've put a small container underneath the adapter for the fuel line and cycled the key a couple of times and drained out a couple of containers full of fuel just to compare it. What's now coming out of the line is a heck of a lot better than what originally came out of the fuel rail. So we're going to give it a shot. We went ahead and lubed up, and as you can see there, we cleaned up all the bottoms of our injectors just to get all the old crud off of them. We re-lubricated all the O-rings, and then we went through the intake and made sure that we brushed off as much dirt as we could from the injector bores, being very careful not to drop any dirt or other contaminants down the injector bores, because remember, with that fuel rail out, you basically got a highway or expressway, if you want to call it that, straight into the intakes of the cylinders themselves once those valves open, if they're not open already. So with that being said, that fuel looking at least a little bit better of what's coming out of that line now. We're gonna go ahead and get this fuel rail reinstalled, get all of our electrical reattached, and obviously the fuel line itself, and then we'll give this thing a crank and see if it made any difference for us. But I'll bring it back in a bit. Bye. And welcome back. So you can see we've got our fuel rail reinstalled. I pulled the fuel pump fuse out for this next test just because I don't want it constantly. I don't want the fuel rail full of pressure, and I don't want this test to constantly just keep pushing raw fuel down in the cylinders. But what I'm going to do, what you can see on the scan tool here, and I did find a record function on the scan tool that I will try out a bit later to hopefully show you this stuff in a little bit better detail rather than you just looking at reflection through a camera. But where I'm at is inside the PCM, inside of actuator tests. And if we find our fuel injector number 5 control state and go into it, when I hit toggle here, you're going to hear the Asd relay, which again is the auto shutdown relay. You're going to hear that come on, and you should be able to hear an audible click, and I'll get you close to the injector once we try this. And that's what was failing before with this bidirectional test. I could actuate the injector, you'd hear it come on, but you never hear the actual injector itself click. So let's give this a shot. And hopefully you can hear that. And I'm going to back out of this test now. There we go. So you'll hear that relay turn off, you'll hear that clicking stop, and that's what was failing before. And what that click is, if I understand correctly, that is the I believe it's called plenum or penum. I believe it's called a plenum. That is that being actuated. And my understanding is what happens is it's a ground side switch to the PCM, just like the coil is. So once it builds up that magnetic field and then cuts off that magnetic field then induces and gets that plenum to basically move, is what then fires the injector. Probably did a horrible job of explaining that, but we weren't hearing a click before, we're hearing a click now. So that was definitely something that was broke before that is now fixed. So what we're going to do is I'm going to put the fuel pump fuse, I'm going to disconnect the battery, put the fuel pump fuse back in, allow everything to come up. We're going to key cycle it a couple of times to build up fuel pressure, and then we're going to go ahead and try to give it a start. I may not try to get that on camera because I'm going to be working several things at the same time in order to do it, but if we are able to get it to successfully start up and run stable, I'll bring it back. If not, I'll bring it back as well and tell you what the next troubleshooting step is going to be. Talk to you in a bit. Bye. And welcome back. So it's been a few hours. We've been chasing down a couple items. And after replacing that fuel injector, it does start and run a tad better than what it was before, but it still has an issue where it wants to stumble and idle and kind of need to be fed the old gas pedal to keep it running. We did do a compression test on one of the cylinders that it was still having a misfire with, even when you bring the idle up, and as long as you bring the idle up to about 1500 RPMs or more, all of the other misfires stop except for cylinder 4. So we went ahead and did a compression test on it, and it's within 20% of a good cylinder. So it doesn't look like it's a compression issue with cylinder 4, and the fact that we're getting multiple misfires at low idle without feeding it gas could still mean a couple of things. So I went and phoned a family member who's been a mechanic for well over 20 years at this point. Kind of reached out and phoned a friend, let him know what we'd found, what we had done thus far, that we had diagnosed a number 5 bad fuel injector. And if you remember from the previous video segment, that fuel injector is now clicking, it's now functional versus what it was before. Like I said, it did help. After reading him the symptoms on it and telling him the year of Dodge it was, which is, again, this is the 2009, right off the top of his head, after giving him the list of symptoms, he immediately came up with fuel pump, and actually told me the number of mileage, probably within about 10,000 miles that we had without me telling him. And he says it's pretty common for these older Dodges when they get up to be about 150, 160, 170,000 miles. He says he typically has to drop a fuel pump in it. Now, unfortunately, that was one of the tests I was going to do this morning after replacing the injector, because I also found online where a weak fuel pump can also cause these exact same symptoms. Again, because we've eliminated compression, we're getting air, we're getting fuel, and we are getting spark. And we eliminated the fact that it could be a potentially bad coil pack, because we took a cylinder that was misfiring and a cylinder that wasn't, swapped it around, and no difference. And the fact that when it does misfire, it's reading 6 out of 8 misfiring, the odds of you having that many bad coil packs are slim. So what I want to do is get the fuel pressure gauge, a fuel pressure tester on that line, and visibly be able to see exactly how weak it is, because in order to change the pump, we have to drop the fuel tank to do so. So I want to be 100% certain that that's the case. Now, my family member that I reached out to, I believe him wholeheartedly, but for the sake of this video, I want to be able to show you guys that if it is in fact a bad fuel pump, what those numbers look like. But unfortunately, the kit I bought does not have an adapter for a Dodge. You can, as we saw earlier, you can see it clipped onto the fuel rail there. It's one of those quick release ones that you need a special tool to get out. But unfortunately, the kit does not come with an adapter that can clip onto the fuel rail, and basically looks like a T, clips onto the fuel rail and then clips into the line coming off the out of the tank, from the pump, and allows you to put a gauge in the middle. Now, I've got a solution for this. I use a solution that you saw if you watched the build video for the 2500 Ram. We actually have an adapter fitting on there that I run a fuel pressure gauge into, a digital one, into the cab, because now that it's supercharged, I got to keep an eye on the fuel pressure. So I'm going to need to order one of those adapters for this truck, so that way we can get a fuel pressure gauge on that rail and be able to do a test. Older Dodges had Schrader valves that you could just easily screw a fuel pressure gauge into. Why the engineers decided to get rid of the Schrader valve on these fuel rails, I have no idea. I checked the scan tool over and over again, and I don't see a PID for fuel pressure, unfortunately. Only what it has listed as calculated fuel pressure, which is what it thinks you might have. So it's going to delay us a little bit in our troubleshooting, but what I wanted to cover was how we diagnosed that we were getting voltage at our coils and our fuel injectors, as well as control. Because again, the coils and the fuel injectors on this motor are ground side switched, and in the case of the the coil packs for the spark plugs, what happens is it has power and ground, and as the coil gets saturated and builds a magnetic field, the PCM will cut ground off, basically switching it off. That field will collapse and induce into the secondary winding of that coil, and then that's what fires your spark plugs. So what we want to do is verify that we're getting voltage and signal. And what I'm going to do is looking for where my helper went. Looks like he went inside for a bit, so I'm going to test out the voltage line of this, which on this particular Dodge, you'll notice all of the voltage lines, in other words what comes from the auto shutdown device, which is just battery 12 volts, is on brown with a white stripe, so it's the center pin. So I just have a little test lead out of our AES wave kit and a test light plugged into ground at this point, and when I turn the key to the on position, that auto shutdown relay, you'll hear it click like it did when we did the injector test, and I should have 12 volts at that pin. Now once we verify that, I'll move the test lead over to this blue wire. I believe that's blue with a white trace. I'm sorry, looks like blue with a brown trace possibly. Now that's the signal, what's called the control into this coil. And I'll put a test light on it, and as we crank the engine, you'll see the test light flash. Now this is just a standard test light with a little LED bulb that you see in it. This one works for this particular case. I do have another test light that's actually digital, has a little digital readout on it. It did not work for measuring the control for the coil because it just seemed like, again, it flashes so fast when it does it. The digital version of this that I had, it was just too fast for it to pick it up, but this one picks it up just fine. Again, this is just a standard LED test light. So with that being said, I'm going to get set up here, and I'm going to put the key on in the ignition, come back, and we're going to test this, and you'll see that we'll have this test light will actually be dead right now because the key's not on or in the ignition. But again, we're going from ground to battery to this line, this which should be a constant 12 volt source, and you'll see the test light is non-operational. So I'm going to go in there, turn the key, come back, and then we should have a lit test light. One moment. Okay, and we're back. I got my son assisting us in the driver's seat there. Okay, let's grab this. Let's make sure that we're grounded. We're on our center pin. Okay, go ahead and turn it on. Okay, turn it off and then on. Okay, there you go. You can see that we now have our test light. You saw it on there momentarily, and the auto shutdown relay does turn it off. So turn it off and on again, so you can see it one more time. So you see we got our test light there, and then off. Okay, good deal. Now, if we were to start cranking it, you would see that light come back on again. So what I'm going to do is now move the pin to the next wire, which is going to be our control wire for our coil. But I'm going to do something also with the test light. Since that's a ground side switched, I'm going to connect test light to battery positive, and then come back and probe that line. I'll bring you right back. Okay, and welcome back. So we've got our lead, our test lead, moved over to our coil control, and you can see our test light is hooked up to battery positive. So you ready to bump the key? So just bump it a few seconds. Yes, bump it a few seconds. See that? There it goes. Flash, flash. Okay, a few more times. Okay, that's good. Now, hopefully you saw that. You saw that light flash as the computer was adding and removing that ground, basically controlling that coil to get that ignition pack to, I'm sorry, coil pack to spark. So that test is the same even with the injectors. You're going to have one line that's going to be battery positive that will be controlled by the auto shutdown relay. So you can go to body ground or battery negative and test that just like we did the coil. And the other side of that is going to be negative switched from the PCM. So you go to battery positive with your test light and probe it, and you'll see it flash just like it did when it was trying to activate the coil. And that will at least verify that you have power and control of your coil and your injectors, and you can start moving on to the next piece. So I'm going to go ahead and post this as a video. I'm going to get that fuel rail adapter on order so we can get a pressure gauge on that fuel rail, and then once we get that in, then we'll take a look at our fuel pressure, and if indeed we can verify that what we have is a weak fuel pump, then we'll get that part on order and commence the drop in the tank and going on with the next piece. But with that being said, I thank you for watching. If you haven't subscribed already and you found my long ramblings useful, please consider subscribing. We're a little over 8, I think we're about 860 subscribers at this point. We're trying to get up to that 1,000 subscriber mark. But again, thank you for watching, and I'll see you on the next one. Thank you much. Bye.